We're going to be taking a quick look at how to use SSIS or SQL Server Integration Services to import data into Infor CRM and have the table ID values automatically generated for us. So one problem that exists with importing data into Infor CRM or SalesLogix is the fact that it uses its own format for table ID values, and that presents a challenge at times. The SalesLogix OLADB provider does allow that to be automatically created or incremented for us, so we don't have to even worry about creating those values at all. But there's a few steps that you need to do in order for that to work. So just as a sample, let's try to create an account record by executing a SQL insert statement. Now this all applies to using the SalesLogix OLADB provider. This doesn't work in all this way that we're going to look at. It doesn't matter if you're doing it directly in SQL using SQL Management Studio. That's kind of irrelevant for this case. For SalesLogix, we're going to use the SalesLogix OLADB provider because that'll give us some of this functionality that we're talking about here. But if I'm going to create an insert statement here, and we're only inserting data into the type field, the account field, and set code ID. We're completely omitting the account ID field from our insert statement. And if I execute this now, I'm going to expect it to fail because account ID is required. So if I execute, we'll say, yeah, it says it failed. The reason is that cannot insert the value null into the account ID field. So to make that work, what we have to do is a few steps. First of all, on the account table, we bring up the properties for the account ID field and check this box that the field is auto increment. That tells the SalesLogix provider to generate those values for us in the case where we've completely left it out of our statement. So I check the box, click OK, and now I'll commit the change. One other thing that I have to do, I'm going to close out the administrator, but one other thing I have to do is restart the SalesLogix server service. So if I right click and restart that, now the SalesLogix provider will recognize the change. I'm going to go back into the administrator and we'll try that same insert statement again. Left out the account ID completely. Now when I execute this, it worked. We can go and look at that record in the database. It did generate an account ID for us. And in addition to that, you'll see we left out of our insert statement create date, modify date, create user, modify user, and it also populated those for us as well. So that's the first step in order to do this is the tables that you're importing into, you do have to turn on auto increment for the primary key fields for that table. Restart the SalesLogix server service, and then as far as the auto incrementing goes, you're good to go. So now let's take a look at how to create a SSIS package to import data into Infor CRM. In Visual Studio, I just created a new project that was of type SQL Server Integration project, and that gave me this empty package here. The first thing we need to do is define some connections. For our sample here, I created this little text file that has a few records in it. It just has the account name, the type, the phone, and the website. And we're going to import that data into the Infor CRM database. So I'm going to right-click down in the connections area at the bottom here and create a new flat file connection. I'm going to browse out to where that file is out on my desktop. And if I go to look at the columns here, everything looks good, and we'll click OK. That's set. So now the other connection we need to make is to our target Infor CRM system. And for that, we're going to use an OLADB connection because we are going to go through the SalesLogix OLADB provider. I'm going to click New here and change the provider at the top to SalesLogix OLADB provider. In my case, I'm just using the server on my local machine, so I'll just put in localhost for the server name change it to a valid SalesLogix user account. I'll just use the admin, and we'll set the initial catalog to the database I want to use. Now we'll test that, and that's great. Now the SalesLogix OLEDB provider is a 32-bit provider, so if you're using this and we're going to execute it on a 64-bit SQL server, you do have to tell it to run it as a 32-bit package. So to do that, I'm going to click OK to close out the connections here. Just to point out, I do have my two connections down here now. If I right-click on the package in the Solution Explorer and bring up the Properties window, under Configuration Properties and let's see, I guess debugging, there is a run 64-bit runtime, and we want that to be false so that it'll run in the 32-bit runtime. Okay, so now the package is all set up. We have our connections defined. First thing I need to do here is create a data flow task. So I'm going to drag a data flow task into my package and then double click on it to bring up the steps that I'm going to define in that data flow task. So the first thing I'm going to do is, if I scroll down in my toolbox here, I have a couple of things for sources and another for destinations. Obviously we need to read from our source flat file, and then we're going to put it into our destination Infor CRM database. So I'm going to grab a flat file source, and if I double click on that, it automatically defaulted the connection to the flat file connection that we've defined in our package already. And if I go to the columns area, here's the columns it's seeing inside of that file. We can preview it. Everything's looking great. So we want to add a few other fields into this import, not just these 4 that are in the file. We want to map, we have to map a value for set code ID. So we'll have to put in a static value of that, and things like account underscore UC needs to be an uppercase value of the account name. So we'll add some of those things as well. So to do that, I'm going to close out my flat file source. I'm going to add another task here called a derived column. I'll just drag it in. First thing I'm going to do is take it from my flat file source to the derived column task, and this is where we're going to add some additional columns to that source data. Double click on it, and the first column I'm going to add is set code ID. It's going to be a new column, and the value for that is going to be SYST. So we're going to put in the value for everyone. Now you'll notice that this is treating this as a Unicode string, and that's going to give some complaints when I run my package because I'm going into non-Unicode fields in the SalesLogix database in my case here. So I can use typecasts and look for DTSTR, which will cast this value as just a non-Unicode string. And in this case it's a length of 12, and the code page that I'm going to use will be 1252. You'll see now that it changed it to just a non-Unicode string. I can add some other things like account manager ID, and that will be just a value of admin for me, and then the account underscore UC will need to be the uppercase account name. So if you look up here, you have string functions, and one of them is upper, and the expression that will pass into that is just from our columns the account name. I also need to tell it that this is a non-Unicode string, and that'll be a length of 64 for this case, still code page of 1252. And that all looks great. So now we've appended these columns to our source data. I'll click OK, and we're good to go. Now what we need to do is take all this and import it into our target. So I'm going to add a destination of an OLEDB destination. We'll drag this to connect it. And now we can double click on that destination. It automatically detected our connection to our SalesLogix OLADB provider connection that we defined earlier. And we're going to be going to the account table. And now when I go to mappings, it will give me this error, which is just due to something that's not implemented in the SalesLogix OLADB provider. That's fine. We just click OK here. And it'll automatically map for us anything that's named the same from the source to the target. Some things aren't, like the account name didn't map that because the column name was a little bit different. We had a phone field that will map to main phone, and a website will map to web address. Everything else looks like it mapped up okay. The key here is for the account ID column, it's set to ignore. We're not going to include that in the insert statement that SSIS runs, so that the SalesLogix provider automatically will create those account IDs for us. And now we're good to go. We'll click OK. This little warning here is that some things might be truncated. Our phone number might be truncated. I'm not worried about that for this case. So now I can run this. And we get the green check mark, meaning everything was successful. So I'll stop that here. And now we can look at the data that was just imported. And we'll see here are those 3 accounts from our source file. It created the account ID values for them. The data from our source file is mapped in just fine. The derived columns that we added are here just fine as well. The uppercase account name and the create and modify fields are all populated as well. So that was meant to be just kind of a high-level demo of importing some data, using SSIS, going through the SalesLogix OLADB provider, and having that table ID value generated automatically for us. There's a lot of information about creating SSIS packages online that you can find out how to do all kinds of more complex tasks in your imports. But the key to all of it is to enable the auto increment property for the primary ID field for the table in the database manager inside of administrator, then restart the SalesLogix server service, and then you're good to go using SSIS just like how you would normally. Hope this was helpful. We'll see ya.